Welcome, Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us after your big trip.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, we're very excited. I'll just introduce you. So, Dr. Patrick Jones is a public speaker and has presented at state, national, and international conferences in psychology and health for over 20 years. He has peer-reviewed and published articles in academic journals, has been an honorary research associate, written curriculum for universities on mindfulness-based entrepreneurship, and is a guest university lecturer and speaker. Patrick has substantial experience in the commercial sector and has founded several companies, a non-for-profit charity, and has managed a portfolio of properties. Patrick has also been a teacher in Eastern ashrams and West monasteries, assisting students on the path of self-realization. His passion is to teach mainstream people on how to achieve a balance of external quality of life and internal well-being. Through clinical work and research, he developed the mindfulness-based quality of life and well-being program, Clear Mind and Open Heart, which has been followed by thousands of people around the world in one-on-one and group settings. He lives in Perth and has a black belt in Taekwondo and is an active triathlete. You're an all-rounder, Patrick. And
I don't know about active triathlete winter, but yeah.
I was a student of Patrick many years ago, and I've used his Clear Mind, Open Heart um, program on many of my clients and found it really, really useful. So thank you so much. So Patrick will be talking about mindfulness training. Can it create superheroes? So take it away.
Great. Thank you. All right. So it's going to be an interesting ride, basically, because mindfulness is a whole new area now that's interfacing with science. And so what we have probably in some ways for the first time is that sort of rapprochement allows us to be able to evaluate some of the claims that over time have been accepted as stock standard in all of the major traditions. Now we get a bit of a peek in there, and actually just to see, especially with the development of imaging and neuroscience particularly, we've actually got to see what actually happens to the brain. So I have kind of two parts really. What I'll be looking at is some of those claims and some of those paths, if you like, and then specifically what's the evidence for some of them and what's our potential. All right, so let's get going. So the way I want to lead it, I'll see into this is through a new area that not everyone may be familiar with, which is the science of heroism that has developed. Now, originally it was kicked off by Philip Zimbardo, who was part of that Stanford experiment where students had the option to either be a prisoner or a prison guard, and there was a tremendous amount of insight that was developed to the point that the experiment became so dangerous they had to stop it midway because students and guards really began to incarnate into those roles, and it just became unethical. Anyway, Zimbardo, from that they deduced what they call the banality of evil, which is that it was quite possible for us to go into dark places that aren't necessarily familiar for us and ones that we typically judge others for going into. Yet we're not exposed to their conditions. Many decades later, he almost, not quite perhaps out of guilt, but certainly he went to the other end, which is explored the banality of heroism, which is the ordinariness, you could say, of not just evil, but the ordinariness of heroism. It's like, how ordinary or normal is it for us to actually be heroes? And so that's the angle I'm coming in today. And what I'm wanting to do in some of my research is the extension of that to what's the banality or ordinariness of a superhero, and what's our potential, our human potential. So the connection to mindfulness is that certainly where that's the origins of Buddhist psychology is that there's been the assertion for all these years that practitioners who attain a high level of an advanced level who are adepts in those practices can develop supernormal capabilities. Now, I came across this extraordinary set of levels, which are very familiar in those traditions if you've gone into them a bit, in some depth, called the jhana states. And they are levels of attention. And what comes with them are also, over time, siddhis or special abilities, as claimed or presented by these traditions. They only come as one progresses up and develops that mental mastery. So we're going to explore just what the evidence is that if people do progress up those, what that looks like. As I started to look at it, I found that there was a growing base of empirical literature, really, that was suggesting that advanced practitioners do actually start to exhibit some of this enhanced functioning. And at a sort of introductory level, some of those effects we started to see were elevated, physical health effects, increased resistance to disease above the norm. This is just from the meditative states. Increased immunity to aging, increased cognitive processing, the shift, you could say, from secondary processing, which is where you're processing through the cognitive editor. I think I should do that, versus primary processing, where it's just almost organic, and it didn't have some of the emotional sort of static or disturbance. So there was an increased speed of that processing, increased resilience. Fear responses were different, less unnecessary fear responses. People became more selfless, just naturally, and therefore more altruistic. Again, all as a consequence of something they weren't intending through these meditative processes, more as an outcome, in effect. Then, particular to this conference, some of the other aspects that we'll be looking at more is an unexpected level of control of what we'd consider to be normally autonomic responses to breathing, heart rate, temperature, that we really can't meddle with mentally, and yet there seemed to be increased capacity to do that. And then some extra paranormal functionality, which we'll look at in more depth. So there are some signs already that these processes, these practices can do that. So we'll have a look at what they are and where I come from. So have had a few roles, one in the psychological role, and also two in some of the monasteries and ashrams over the years, teaching some of the spiritual stuff, if you would like to call it that, in those traditions. But where I come from in this is, if this is our capacity, then we might want to look at what we could do to uncover that capacity within us. So there isn't a whole lot of research on the absolutely highest levels of the advanced people, and I think that's probably an area that needs to increasingly be looked at, but there certainly is growing evidence. So today, the superhero, I would say, is one of the outcomes of an advanced mindfulness meditation practitioner. And with that comes the full suite of, say, paranormal, if you will, supernormal capabilities. Okay, so just have a quick background with the heroism component. Just what that is, we'll go from hero to superhero and what that looks like. So with the science now of heroism specifically, the hero, they've found it does have a few characteristics that are able to be understood, and they are, so one of them is that they're characterized by what you call pro-social activity. So if something is contrary to the status quo, they don't mind if it's going to help someone. But with the heroes, they share some, but not all, qualities of moral role models. They do have that, ultimately, that respect for humanity in terms of their action. How they do it is not always agreed upon in the world at the time. whether that's Martin Luther King at the time not being agreed with, or a Gandhi or whoever it is. They have a willingness to act in accord with their own ideals. And there's often a sense of self-sacrifice for the interest of others. Again, the banality of heroism, they would say, is that people typically after some event, they would say, well, anyone would have done that, jumped on the train track, dragged the person off before the train. The reality is most people don't. The bystander effect basically paralyzes most people to watch versus act. And that's also part of some of the social psychology research that's found that a group diffuses responsibility. So if you're by yourself, you feel 100% responsible. If you perhaps with 10 people, you feel 10% responsible. It's not quite that statistical, but the idea is that with groups, we seem to spread our sense of accountability. The heroes don't seem to be impacted, or someone who has got that heroic impulse doesn't seem to be impacted by that particular phenomenon, and they just jump in. But they want to get back to being part of the group again. So hence, when they're asked, why did you do that? And they say, well, anyone would have done it. So I'm still one of you guys. All right. The issue with, and that's where came in with the science of heroism research. The issue with the heroes and the heroic acts is that they're not consistently heroic. They can't be relied upon to save the world. They might be able to do it on one occasion or occasionally, but it's not necessarily imbued. It's not necessarily, they're not very marinated in that way, being all the time in every aspect of their life. But obviously, if you think, well, if it's possible once, it's in there, it's our capability. So we then move to the mystical tradition. They say, well, at the upper end, that's how our players play. That's what they do, day in, day out. And in the Buddhist tradition, they say the perfected bodhisattva, that's all they do. So if we look at in line with Aristotle's function argument, that if all things have he basically said that all things have a function and their meaning is found in the full expression of that function, then you could argue, what is the full functional potential of a human being? And to follow on from that, therefore, when we're activating that fully, then we're activating, in a sense, our meaning fully. So can we learn to activate this and go further from the banality of heroism, just from a normal person to a hero to a superhero, and watch that progression? And what we find in basically coming in through the mindfulness door, which there are many, obviously, its origins are Buddhist psychology, but its claims are that the master practitioners can and do manifest superhero-like capabilities, levitation, telekinesis, agelessness, extraordinary feats of superhuman ability. So now we have mindfulness and science under the microscope, and we have a chance to look a little further at what some of this is. And do we have any hints that we might be a little closer to what brings that about? So I pretty much define that superhero, if you like, as someone who can demonstrate those abilities well beyond the expected norms of human capacity, including control over mental and physical processes that can transcend the known laws of physics. So that's really where we're starting, is the foundation of the operational definition of what we're talking about here. So it's definitely not average stock standard well-being. And my critique in the mindfulness and psychology fields is that we are being sold short of what both well-being and mindfulness can deliver. At the emergency department level and the hospital level, I think, the mindfulness practices are extremely relevant to assist people to go from crisis to being able to cope. And so coping and resilience is really always step one. Emergency, you want to get people okay first. But then coping and resilience should not be the end. It's set as a ceiling in many conversations about mental health. And as they say, I'm a stand for more than that, because that's selling happiness short. In the major traditions, that that's really almost what they would call a non-practitioner, where they're simply just a good person trying to get through life. They're definitely not an evil person, of course, but they're managing their state based upon the standard kind of quality of life definition, which is a combination of cognition, affect, and life conditions together. And from that, you get your life satisfaction, and the quality of life is the gap between your perceived outcomes and your expectations. And the bigger that gap is, the wider your perceived sense of quality of life is. And your whole goal, in a sense, is to maximize your pleasure and minimize your pain. And presumably do that as if you can, a win-win, so that everyone feels better and doesn't feel worse. But there's what we'd call event-based well-being. Is dependent upon these events going well. So you have to keep trying to adjust them, because the nature of phenomena is that it's impermanent. It keeps changing. It's not a belief system. It's just empirical, evidence-based phenomena. Has to keep needing to keep renewing itself, and in a stage of either creation, maintenance, or destruction. There's three kind of cycles of phenomena. That process that's typically used for happiness, quality of life, and well-being is about maintaining that phenomena in the most optimal state, and maintaining our mental state about that. So that is really a level one, and not, in a sense, even the first stage of mindfulness. What we're talking about today is a complete other end. It's where that sense of well-being, happiness, is completely independent of phenomena whatsoever. And here's where we get the mastery of the phenomena at this point, because we're activating some state or way of being that's beyond that phenomena, and therefore it seems to develop some level of mastery around that. So I'm going to cover off just on some jhana states and what they are, but essentially they are levels of concentration that progressively continue up 8 stages, if you could say, and along the way mental control increases. Then I'm going to look at some of the cities or abilities that come as a natural outcome of that, and then going to turn to some of the research and say, where are we on that scale? Okay. So essentially, the path of mindfulness, Buddhist psychology and the Hindu traditions have quite a lot of information. Now, say I've mentioned a little bit on Buddhism in the Hindu tradition, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. These are worth having a look at them for levels or chapters, and they see that as you progress, these abilities are natural milestones, and that control of the external world seen as growing parallel with your internal development. Now, we're all familiar with religions that have great feats of people doing amazing things, but it's always asserted that there are people in the world the whole time that are already at this level, and this is the perfected level as all the way along this capacity, both in terms of that loving kindness, egolessness way of being continues to grow along with those capabilities. So it's a progression, but it's always seen that there are people that are fully perfected in that. And in the Hindu tradition, you could say there are a number. Certainly, one that I would go to spend time with in India on retreat most years is Amma. Her name's Amma. The Hindu tradition, and basically a peasant girl from a poor fishing village, and decades later there are universities, hospitals, millions of disciples all around this one little human being, protected by the Indian military as a national treasure. These people are powerful human beings, and they demonstrate these capacities. Obviously not overtly, because that's not how anyone rolls. But then again, in the Buddhist tradition, you could say that many would also see the Dalai Lama as that. Though, of course, his lovely self-proclamation is, that people think, that I have all these great abilities, and he always just says, no, I'm a simple Buddhist monk, nothing more. And each tradition would say that they can offer people like this already. Anna, in fact, herself, I did some talks there at one of her universities, and they are doing research literally on the, through neuroscience, and I got plugged up as well. And they tested brain responses in meditative states, and they're really looking quite responsibly at what's possible for us. So the dialogue between science and these traditions is definitely there. Okay, so just before we move into some of that, just a quick observation in terms of the burgeoning realm of mindfulness is primarily being used for more clinical application, you could say, in the psychological traditions, and also in terms of just general relaxation and well-being, which of course is so helpful, so useful as an initial stage. But the invitation should be to keep going. But one of the issues that comes with that is that it has been the critique around that is that it's been extracted from its origins, its context, and in doing so, some of the critically important stuff has missed the boat in that export. But essentially, mindfulness, for those who don't quite know the definition, it's more sort of judgmental attention to the present moment, an ability to self-regulate your behaviour in more social ways, more pro-social sort of egoless or loving kindness is one of the other terms they would use. And the capacity to be in the moment, and no judgment around it. There are a few problems that may come with that. Sometimes people get stuck in the moment and they don't get responsible about evaluating the past or being able to plan well for the future. So lots of traps for young players in this work, but essentially it's that capacity to be able to just be present, be still, without judging that moment, and allowing and accepting, allowing emotions, physical sensations to come and go as what they would call passing mental events, and to watch thought as it rises and falls without judging it or engaging with it. And then if one progresses a little further, it's capacity to actually then, in that sitting, that allowing, that watching, to then sit in the gap between thought and just rest. And from there, this next stuff starts to happen. So we could obviously, in a different talk, we would spend more time drilling and going deeper into that. But here we're looking at the capabilities that come as someone practices and becomes more advanced in some of these methods. I do want to highlight that it's a very pragmatic practice, because over time it's about first internal mastery and then external mastery. So it's that balance. Okay, so back to now the critique, just before we go, we need to, in a sense, have a bit of foundation of what we're not talking about. One of the questions about the current use of the mindfulness is that it doesn't really have a cohesive, comprehensive model that says it's this. It doesn't sort of delineate like a predictable stepwise progression of the practitioner from this to this to this, from a watching to what we'd call in that gap beyond thought, that falling away of that sense of an I, a separation, into what we'd call that non-dual awareness, from which those abilities then can move. So in a way, it's partly been cobbled together with different people taking different things that are really useful, but they don't have that kind of contextual direction, you could say. So that's one, which then presents with a few sort of validity issues, some diluting of training methods. And some practitioners might be using different methods for different things. So whether, observing the breathing is necessarily useful if a loving kindness meditation is relevant. Okay, so we won't stay there, but essentially that's just to look at that. What we're going to do today is really go to where it came from, these origins, because there the whole package is there, and from there we can see what those capabilities are. Just an example though of that in meditation. One of the things is that capacity to develop what they call single-pointed concentration. So to have an unwavering, unflinching, sort of present moment, drill down awareness or concentration on a single point. And it doesn't move. Now, if you're not trained at all, you can't do that. Mind just goes everywhere. If you're trained at a kind of introductory and intermediate level, you really can get quite good at that, really just being able to just stay in the moment. But they've noticed, I'll go into this a little later, but notice that in those beginner and intermediate people, that's the brain showing that there's effort. They're really doing well, and they can, which is great. The advanced level is progressed to no effort. Still doing it, but the brain's not signaling it's actually doing that, it's concentrating. So different parts of the brain fire up. So that's just an example of who people might be doing the same practice, but be getting very different results based upon how far they've gone and how they've used it. But if we go now to the more advanced, along with that is the presence, in a sense, of this non-dual awareness, or self-transcendent events, anomalous experiences, or religious experiences, mystical experiences. So these are sort of where you get to separate out the normal meditative relaxation from something else just happened, and in that meditation, and I don't know what happened, where I went, etc. So this is sort of really the area that we're talking about today. These states, if you like, is where it's like a dissolution of the sense of an abiding or separate sense of self, or anatta, as some traditions call it, a perception of the oneness or connection to people and surroundings as one of the symptoms or outcomes, you could say. So this is also called like an opening or an awakening to that non-dual experience. And it seemed to be resulting from the removal of this cognitive, perceptual, sensory layer of information processing that's going on. And once that falls away, it leads to a more expanded and unitary state of consciousness. And once you're in that field, then this other stuff can kick off. Just before we go to those next bits, Joseph Campbell in the Hero's Journey, the saint in particular. So again, these are things I'm mentioning are great reads, great books to look at. He outlines the stages of human development where people undergo this moral, mental, emotional, physical, spiritual transformation. And just a nice quote I'll give from him is that the individual, through prolonged psychological disciplines, gives up completely all attachment to his personal limitations, idiosyncrasies, hopes and fears, no longer resists the self-annihilation that is prerequisite to rebirth in the realization of truth, and so becomes ripe at last for the great at-one-ment. So transpersonal psychologists and theorists have used different language for this over time, but that's really the sort of the foundational steps. Okay. As I'm doing some of this contextual gathering and introduction, one could ask, well, okay, so let's get to some of that now. It's funny, but when you go to some of the really masterful traditions, teachings, it might be like a 2-hour teaching, and an hour and a half or an hour and 3/4 sounds like introduction. It's like, get to the bit. And it's quite interesting how so much of the preparation and contextual work needs to be done, so we know what we're not talking about and what we're not doing. It just reminds me of this as setting up some of these parts of the stage. Finally, I guess we just hit off on Wittgenstein and his amazing Tractatus, which I'm not saying like almost everyone else that I can fully understand, but there are parts that I've studied, and his classic line that is known by some, which is, of that which we cannot speak about, we should remain silent. So for some of that, issued in a very real verificationist approach that, if it's gobbledygook or woo-woo, then, if you can't base evidence around it, then it's rubbish, and it's not actually what that necessarily means. Second, Wittgenstein tried to explore that with looking at aesthetics, metaphysics. But it's this beyond that we can't speak about that doesn't mean it's not there. And in the theological traditions, my degree after my first psychology was in theology. There's this nice notion of noesis, a noetic quality of something, which is an experience that it's intangible. Might be a divine experience, a mystical experience, but it's so the knowing of it is so strong that people would say its noetic quality is feels more real than an actual verifiable quality. So it's because it's not able to be verified doesn't mean we can't necessarily go the other way and negate it. So Buddhist scholar Alan Wallace talks about what can we do about this. He says, in Buddhism, there are not miracles in the sense of being supernatural events any more than the discovery and amazing uses of lasers, so laser therapy, are miraculous. However, they may appear to those ignorant of the nature and potentials of light. Such contemplatives claim to have realised that the nature and potentials of consciousness far beyond anything known in contemporary science. What may appear supernatural to a scientist or a layperson may seem perfectly natural to an advanced contemplative. The Dalai Lama talks about, still in view of that, still encouraging scientific responsibility. He says that I'm well aware, however, of the danger of tying spiritual belief to any scientific system, because he says they're more a philosophy than a religion. So hence great vigilance must be maintained at all times when dealing in areas about what we don't have great understanding, because we don't want to just make it flaky. But then he also goes on to encourage, and he's done a lot of work to encourage scientific inquiry into the practices, Buddhist psychology practices. But then he encourages by also saying, after all, we consider things to be mysterious only when we do not understand them. But through mental training, we have developed techniques to do things which science cannot yet adequately explain. So encourages responsibility, but highlights. We still know stuff you guys don't. And we're really encouraging you to try and build up the scientific arsenal so you can get to see what we see. Okay, so if we go to the Buddha's premises, you could say, that build these states as a side effect. The Four Noble Truths are their entry point, which, of course, to recap, the first Noble Truth is often summarized that life is suffering. It's not quite the right translation. Life is empty of inherent satisfaction, dukkha. In other words, the phenomena itself, because it's always moving, can't inherently satisfy, like as an ongoing thing. It's just impossible. So life, number one, life is empty of inherent satisfaction. You can't be the thing that delivers it. Second Noble Truth, the source of suffering is craving, made up of three parts: too much desire, too much wanting this thing that's always going to change, too much aversion, not wanting this thing to go, or this bad thing to happen. and ignorance, that the third part, that if I get that combination right, then I will be happy. That's the thing. And that is typically the quality of life dominant model at the moment in psychological literature, essentially. The third is that there's a way out of the suffering, there's a method to achieve this. And then the fourth noble truth is the eightfold path, which are all the different ways to be able to build this capacity to be happy, of which those capacities also develop. But in all the traditions, when I started to research this, I was in India at the time, looking at in a lovely place called Tiruvannamalai, where Sri Ramana Maharshi used to live, a 16-year-old boy that basically left home and sat in such profound, unmoving meditative states for days and days and days. Rats were eating him and attacking him and whatever else, and he just didn't move. And eventually people noticed and started to try and protect him. Anyway, he lived on this mountain to the point to where he didn't always say a whole lot, but he was a very powerful human and influenced, in a sense, that a lot of this coming to the West through the subsequent different traditions that then moved into Western satsang, Western traditions. But when I was there and was having a look at some of this in their libraries and other places, aware of also this in the Buddhist tradition, there is an absolute disinterest in learning anything about this stuff, to the point that it is the reverse. It's like, don't get interested in this stuff, because it'll take you away from the path. It'll take you away from the point. It's not like what I love about that is that it's not like this defensive. No, it's true. We can. It's sort of like, it's so accepted that it's an outcome. It's a side effect. Don't get distracted. So there's an absolute acknowledgement of that capability, to the point to where it's encouraging to be disinterested versus trying to promote it. But times change, and there's also ways to be able to do this in a responsible way, especially as we're becoming more scientific. But the reason they're saying this, in the Tibetan Buddhist school of Dzogchen, they have a sequence which is the first step of training in Treko is targeting basically this non-dual awareness, or this awakening enlightenment experience, or the development of the dissolving, the falling away of the sense of self or ego, or egolessness. Step one, once completed, can then be followed by the advanced practices of Togul, which actually includes training in special abilities and the service of others. And the order is seen as critical because you want to be able to develop this pure egoless foundation as one starts to develop extra capabilities, so as to not create the basically like the black ninja, or someone who hasn't dissolved their narcissistic tendencies and becomes quite powerful is dangerous. The anti-hero. And as we can obviously see at any stage in history and now, anyone with power and with flaws in their approach to others can have a very detrimental impact. So these do build powers. So hence they always say, dissolve the ego first, and then we'll teach you some access to the powers. Or typically in the other traditions, it's mainly the effect as you progress. So highlighting some of the Buddhist things with Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, from different traditions, if you like, but all talk about this perfection of this practitioner, the Arahat Bodhisattva Mahasiddha. all of them say that in the end, this special ability, the abilities that do occur, are just so different from this normative functioning. And the reason why it is seen to occur is that they have seen through the illusion of the subjective self and the objective phenomena as being inherently separate or different, so that the need for a me to do a this to that dissolves, or you could say that the seer, the seeing, and the seen are the same. That there's some unifying quality to that, and therefore the capacity to do something around it is, the relationship to it is very different. I'm not trying to push something outside of me around if there's already a connection that it's in some ways some element to who I am. It shares with some element of that anyway. So I think we're ready for just some of the jhana states. I said I was a practitioner for decades before I even came across these. And I literally remember I was sitting in the Irish club waiting for some goddamn show, I think, to start with parents or whatever it was. And, you know, I say that because when you read something or have some experience, similarly like to trauma as well, it absorbs your whole awareness that everything around you gets imprinted. So it's clear to me that the impact of just finding out about these states and reading them in this nondescript bar waiting for something, and having taken some book and it happened to be including 2 pages on this, was just someone has just told me about myself. It's just extraordinary. The jhana states, where have you been all my life? Because you get to argue, I wasn't even ready to know what they were. Okay, so they are basically 8 stages of concentration levels. And again, back to why this has taken this context layering, is because this stuff is not typically talked about, because it's seen as the secondary bit, to do the work. But I think it's also, for some reason, part of my interest seems to be to keep presenting some of this material to responsible people to actually explore themselves and be inspired to go further. So that's kind of the context. For example, I was just in Vietnam yesterday, and I was sitting in a 14th century Buddhist cave there, and there's literally these really old temples and stupas and these beautiful caves, these extraordinary, exquisite designs. And there were literally imprints of mantras on the cave walls that were centuries old. And there's of all these different quite beautiful things, there was one little tiny little cave, just a broom in it, that had this black smoke going up the wall. And because they don't live in these caves now, so this was centuries ago, these people were in here. And there's sages sitting in these caves from the 14th century onwards, doing this stuff that we're talking about right now. And of course, that's the place I choose to sit and do my meditation amongst these sages. And again, for some, this may not resonate at all. But the 8 jhana states. Just to highlight, the first one is, I'm literally just going to walk straight through them and move on. But this first one is typically not even the standard average mindfulness practitioner wouldn't really ever touch this. Just the first one. So that's almost just the foundation. Anyway, first jhana is what they call joy. It's the state of continuous concentration with no interruptions and pleasant sensations or bliss in the background, which would be nice as a meditation. Wow. Continuous concentration, no interruptions, pleasant sensations. Background. Second jhana, what they call contentment, one lets go of the previous physical and emotional pleasures and moves to motionless, quiet contentment. So now, no bliss, just quiet. Third jhana, utter peacefulness, is a sense of equanimity with no positive or negative feeling and an all-pervading, peaceful one-pointedness of mind. So a sense of equanimity, there, no real preference for this or that. And fourth jhana, infinity of space. There's an experience of absorption without form. Attention shifts beyond the body as if watching oneself, and the self is experienced as the expanse of empty space. So in most accounts, that it's really only after these first four material jhanas, they're sometimes called, that the extra mental abilities might start to manifest. So if you're typically even a normal meditation mindfulness practitioner, typically hasn't entered hasn't entered the first one, or might have a flitting state experience, but that's it. You have to kind of make your way through all of these, past at least four of them, before then these next levels occur. In the normal progression, what I have seen also, and maybe this conference explores more of those things too, is that there are other access points to some of these capabilities. Perhaps others have also done training in different ways to access different potentialities. But in terms of these traditions, it's more, if these seem as a natural unfolding, they occur after you've hit typically past this four. So the remaining four, then fifth jhana, is what they call infinity of consciousness. Awareness that infinite space includes one's own consciousness. And the attention shifts to infinite consciousness, oneness with nature and existence. So that that normal, particular, limited sense of consciousness is not just limited just to you. Okay. And then we go to sixth jhana, no-thingness, realization that infinite consciousness itself is empty of inherent existence, that all is impermanent and changing. Seventh jhana, neither perception nor non-perception. Here there is a going beyond the duality of perception and non-perception, and yet there's still awareness. And finally, eighth jhana, which is the cessation altogether of overt consciousness. And there is only a subtle perception remaining. So someone can actually appear unconscious, yet they're perfectly one with everything. Okay, so then once those are in place, psychokinesis, we then move into basically Hinduism, what we might be calling the siddhis, and of which in some traditions they can number as many as 24. And they are extraordinary. So the sixth would be the performing of miracles, which is once these concentration states are in place in every tradition, they will manifest in different ways. Performing of miracles is one, they would call it, or psychokinesis, which is the attainment of these extraordinary physical powers. Walking on water, passing through solid objects, flying, celestial hearing, which is clairaudience. Ability to hear sounds from far away or other realms. The knowledge of thoughts, telepathy, communicate without words, understanding. Knowledge of past and future. And knowledge of basically events in any time zone, you could say. Celestial vision is another one that they call, which is clairvoyance, the ability to see minute detail or far away, the nature of one's or others' minds, and ultimately the eradication of that sense of self. So they're, in a sense, some of the capabilities that then come from those. And those siddhis are seen as just that outcome, just that result. building up the attentional capacities. So just as we sort of bring it to close over the next 5 minutes or so, consciousness is really where the research has now been looking at, just what have these practices done in terms of consciousness. And they've found that during the meditative practices, there have been sort of decreased activity in areas that are connected. Specifically, if you're using a concentrated practice like focusing on the breath, you get a decrease in activities in the lateral prefrontal cortex. So if there's a experience of a undistracted awareness or effortless doing, then those areas that are relevant for concentration, just literally, or efforting, literally just don't need to work, and yet the same skill set is still being performed. One of the ones I really like is that this insular part of the brain has been found to check body states every 125 milliseconds. So it's a little bit like, instead of, are we there yet? Are we there yet? It's like, am I here now? Am I here now? Like continually checking, creating these emotional frames of reference. But when someone's in a meditative state or an altered state of consciousness, this sort of gets interrupted, and that continual mirroring, I'm here, it just doesn't happen. And other researchers found that the brain has these sort of 11 sort of selfing centers, and that they all play a different role to give you a sense of time, or timelessness, or unity, or connection. And that when you go into these progress, those things fall away and they become sort of less relevant. So there's a lot of things that they've found that are especially also increasing grey matter. The actual brain size can be increased through different practices. Key areas that are relevant. And the second area that I was looking at was just these autonomic nervous system or responses that have been found to be able to be played with. It's extraordinary. So, Swami Rama, someone you could also have a look at, to expert meditator. He was literally hooked up to different devices that were able to assess his body temperature, and he literally was able to move the left, or change the temperature of the left and right sides of his hand after 3 minutes to 11, and it's in America, 11 Fahrenheit apart in terms of temperature differences between the left and right hand. Capacity to do that, it's not within cognitive control. He was able to stop his heart from pumping blood for 16 seconds with no detectable pulse, going to zero other than atrial flutter, and then able to bring it straight back to baseline. Of course, people are familiar perhaps now with the Wim Hof stuff, but in the Tibetan Buddhist traditions of Tumo, they can increase they've looked at Benson studies that the temperature of their fingers and toes increase up to 8 degrees Celsius through practices. So Swami Rama again was looked at how he could bring his breathing down, which averages perhaps 15 times per minute. He could bring it down to 1 to 2 breaths per minute on an ongoing level. So these were some of the areas, and then finally in some of the work done with the Dalai Lama's work in terms of allowing people to assess some of the advanced adepts. They looked at some of the, not just in the Hindu tradition, the Swamis, but also in the Tibetan traditions, not so much the Rinpoches, but the Lamas. And they found essentially this psi-conducive state is really what they would call it, which is that when the mind gets into a relaxed, non-distracted mental state, they have this increased capacity to perceive non-tangible phenomena. And that essentially is kind of bringing this home. It's this psi-conducive state that they found makes the difference. And when they actually looked at people who were quite advanced at that, they found that they could, once they were in there, their capacity to identify hidden objects from beginner versus advanced was significantly different, both before a meditation and after a meditation, and between a beginner and an advanced. We're talking about significance, from a statistical point of view, as not by chance. And the pivotal bit was this psi-conducive state. So that pretty much brings us to the end, that the preparation is really critical in these traditions, but if done properly, you can produce this psi-conducive state. But to be a white ninja and not a black ninja is really critical, and hence the preparation is always the first step. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. That was fascinating. I think we need 2 hours to cover this subject.
I've recently, just as a reference if anyone's interested, I've just peer-reviewed a book. It's called Happiness, the Psychology of Enlightenment. And in that, I include a chapter on the progressive stages of enlightenment. And the introduction looks at many different paths. I only just covered a couple of that. One of the ones is that, the Zen sort of 10 steps up the mountain and back. And you will encounter multiple invitations to challenge oneself. And the return then back into the world is usually the completion of that. But Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, many dragons will be faced along the way, and some want to kill you. So be prepared on the journey.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick. That was amazing. That was really fascinating. The human potential, and but to stay focused on our purpose throughout all that, be a white ninja and not a dark ninja, because it can be so powerful, these abilities. But thank you. And anyone who wants to know more, drpatrickjones.com, have a look there.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks, Joyce.